We were driving down an old, tree-lined road when Zach broke the silence. "So, ready for the perfect getaway?" If by perfect, you mean no internet, no TV, and a house older than my grandmother, then sure, I'm thrilled, I replied with a smirk. Zach laughed, his eyes briefly leaving the road to glance at me. "Come on, Emily. It's just a couple of days. Besides, you're the one who wanted something different." He wasn't wrong. The monotony of work and city life had left me craving a break. But as we neared the house, an uneasy feeling began creeping into my chest. The GPS pinged, and Zach slowed the car. "This is it," he said, pointing to a massive Victorian mansion partially obscured by overgrown trees. The house loomed before us like a forgotten relic of another era. Its paint was peeling, shutters hung crookedly, and ivy had begun consuming the stone walls. Yet, despite its decrepit state, there was something strangely beautiful about it, like it was frozen in time. "It's got character," I said, trying to sound optimistic. Zach chuckled as he pulled the car to a stop in the gravel driveway. Character is one word for it. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves as we got out of the car. Grabbing our bags, we walked up the creaky wooden steps to the front door. Zach unlocked it with a key the host had left in a lockbox, and the door swung open with an eerie creak that seemed to echo through the empty halls. "Home sweet home," Zach announced, stepping inside. The interior was almost exactly what I'd expected: high ceilings, faded wallpaper, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and old wood. "Wow," I said, setting my bag down. "This place really is authentic." "Yeah," Zach agreed, peeking into one of the rooms. "Authentically creepy." After unpacking, we decided to explore the house. The kitchen was surprisingly modern, with stainless steel appliances that looked out of place against the antique cabinetry. The dining room had a long, polished oak table surrounded by mismatched chairs, and the living room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace. We climbed the winding staircase to the second floor, where the bedrooms were located. The master bedroom had a canopy bed draped in faded fabric and a large, ornate mirror propped against one wall. "This'll do," Zach said, flopping onto the bed. I wandered over to the mirror, running my fingers along its gilded frame. The glass was slightly foggy, distorting my reflection just enough to make it unsettling. "Don't stare too long," Zach teased. "You'll start seeing things." I rolled my eyes and turned away, but his words lingered in my mind. Later that evening, after dinner and a few glasses of wine, we settled into the living room. Zach lit a fire in the fireplace, and the warm glow filled the space, making the shadows dance along the walls. "This isn't so bad," I admitted, snuggling up next to him on the couch. "Told you," he said, grinning. Just as I started to relax, I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. I sat up. "Did you hear that?" Zach tilted his head, listening. The house was silent. "It's an old place," he said. "Probably just the wood settling." I nodded, but my heart was racing. The creak came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like soft footsteps. "Zach," I whispered, gripping his arm. "Okay, I heard that," he said, standing up. He grabbed the flashlight we brought and headed toward the stairs. "Stay here," he told me. "Like hell I will," I shot back, following him. We crept up the staircase, the old wood groaning under our weight. The hallway was dark, save for the beam of Zach's flashlight, which illuminated the worn rug and faded wallpaper. "Hello." Zach called out, his voice firm but nervous. No answer. We checked each room, finding nothing but dusty furniture and shadows. Finally, we reached the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, though we were certain we'd left it closed. Zach pushed it open, and the flashlight's beam swept across the room. The mirror. It had moved. What the? Zach started, but his words caught in his throat. The mirror, which had been leaning against the wall earlier, was now standing upright in the center of the room. And in its reflection, I saw something that wasn't there. A figure. It stood just behind Zach, tall and shadowy, with eyes like pinpricks of light. Zach, I choked out, grabbing his arm. He turned, but the room was empty. What is it? He asked, looking at me. The mirror, I whispered. It's showing something else. Zach turned back to the mirror, and for a moment, his face paled. Then, just as quickly, he shook his head. It's just our imaginations, he said, though his voice wavered. This place is old, it's playing tricks on us. But as we left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That the house was watching. Waiting. The rest of the night passed uneasily. Zach and I returned to the living room, but the warmth of the fire no longer felt comforting. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the flames, set my nerves on edge. We didn't talk much after the incident with the mirror. Zach kept trying to laugh it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed. The master bedroom felt different now. The air was heavier, and shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. I avoided looking at the mirror as I crawled under the covers, but its presence loomed, pulling at the edge of my awareness. Just a couple more days, Zach murmured as he turned off the light. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was reassuring him or myself. I didn't realize I'd fallen asleep until I woke up, gasping for breath. My chest felt tight, like something heavy had been pressing down on me. The room was dark, the firelight from downstairs casting faint shadows through the cracks under the door. Zach was sound asleep beside me, his steady breathing the only sound in the room. But then I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the hall or outside the window. It was coming from the mirror. I sat up slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The mirror's surface seemed to shimmer in the darkness, almost like it was breathing. Emily. My name. I froze. The whisper was faint but unmistakable, carried on a voice I didn't recognize. Zach. I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He stirred, grumbling something incoherent, but didn't wake up. The whisper came again, louder this time. Emily. I couldn't help myself. I slid out of bed and approached the mirror, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. As I got closer, the air around the mirror seemed to shift, growing colder. I could see my reflection, but it was wrong. My face was pale, my eyes wide and frightened. Behind me, the room stretched on into darkness, far longer than it should have been. Emily, come closer, the whisper urged. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling as they hovered just above the glass. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the reflection, slamming against the glass with a deafening thud. I screamed, stumbling backward and crashing into the bedside table. Zach bolted upright, his eyes wide. What happened? He shouted. I pointed to the mirror, my voice caught in my throat. But when Zach turned on the light, the mirror was just a mirror again, no shimmering surface, no ghostly hand. Emily, what the hell is going on? It touched the glass, I stammered. Something in the mirror, it tried to grab me. Zach rubbed his face, looking equal parts tired and concerned. You were dreaming. That's all. This house is messing with our heads. No, Zach, I insisted, my voice rising. I wasn't dreaming. I know what I saw. He sighed and pulled me into a hug. Look, it's late. Let's just try to sleep. We can figure this out tomorrow. I wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. I climbed back into bed, but I didn't close my eyes. Morning came reluctantly, with pale sunlight streaming through the curtains. Zach was already up, busying himself with breakfast in the kitchen. I stayed in bed longer than usual, reluctant to face the mirror again. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the room, I found Zach sitting at the kitchen table with a map spread out in front of him. "What's that?" I asked, grabbing a cup of coffee. "A map of the area," he said. "I thought we could go for a hike or something. Get out of the house for a while." I didn't need convincing. The idea of fresh air and open space was exactly what I needed. We set off mid-morning, following a narrow trail that wound through the woods behind the house. The trees were dense, their branches weaving together to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into scattered patches. The further we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of nature, birdsong, rustling leaves, faded into an eerie stillness. "Feels like we're the only people on Earth," Zach said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I agreed, though the stillness was beginning to unsettle me. As we rounded a bend, I noticed something odd, a clearing up ahead. In the center of the clearing stood a small, weathered cabin. "Was this on the map?" I asked. Zach shook his head. "No. I didn't even know this was here." We approached cautiously, the leaves crunching underfoot. The cabin was ancient, its wooden walls warped and cracked with age. A rusty iron bell hung above the door, swaying gently despite the absence of wind. "This feels like a bad idea," I said, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. "Just a quick look," Zach said, already heading for the door. Inside, the cabin was dark and cramped, filled with dust and cobwebs. Shelves lined the walls, covered in jars of strange, unidentifiable objects. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing a large, oval mirror. The mirror was identical to the one in our bedroom. "Zach," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But Zach was staring at the mirror, his face pale. "Emily," he said, his voice barely audible. "There's someone in the mirror." I turned to look. And my blood ran cold. Inside the mirror, a figure stood, shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but its glowing red eyes burned into mine. The figure raised a hand and pointed directly at me. And then the mirror shattered. The sound of the mirror shattering was deafening, echoing through the small cabin like a gunshot. I instinctively ducked, shielding my face as shards of glass flew everywhere. When I finally dared to look up, Zach was frozen, his eyes fixed on the now empty frame where the mirror had been. The glass shards on the floor shimmered with an unnatural light, pulsing faintly before dimming and going dark. The air in the cabin felt heavier, suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. "Zach," I whispered, reaching for his arm. He didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the broken mirror, his face pale and expressionless. "Zach." I shook him harder this time, my voice sharp with fear. Finally, he blinked and looked at me, but his eyes seemed distant, like he wasn't entirely there. "Did you see it?" he murmured. "The figure, it was calling you." I nodded, my stomach knotting with unease. "We shouldn't have come here. We need to go back to the house. Now." But Zach shook his head, his expression hardening. "No. This means something. That mirror, it's connected to what's happening at the house. We can't leave without figuring it out." I wanted to argue, to grab him and drag him back down the trail if I had to, but something in his voice stopped me. "Fine," I said reluctantly. "But if anything else happens, we leave immediately." We searched the cabin, though every creak of the floorboards and every shadow in the dim light made my skin crawl. Most of the jars on the shelves were filled with things I couldn't recognize: dried herbs, discolored bones, and what looked like twisted roots. A few contained liquids that shifted and swirled unnaturally, their color shifting like oil on water. On a small wooden table near the back of the room, we found a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. Zach picked it up, carefully thumbing through the pages. Most of the writing was in a language neither of us recognized, full of looping symbols and jagged lines that hurt my eyes to look at for too long. But a few entries were written in English. "Here," Zach said, pointing to a passage near the middle of the journal. I leaned in to read over his shoulder. "The mirrors are the gateways. They see what we cannot, reveal what is hidden. But they must be used with caution. The entity within them hungers for the unwary. Once it marks you, there is no escape." A cold chill ran down my spine. "The entity," I whispered. Before Zach could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin, loud and sudden in the silence. We both froze, staring at the door. The knock came again, this time more insistent. Who would be out here?" I stammered. Zach didn't answer. He set the journal down and slowly moved toward the door, his movements careful and deliberate. "Zach, don't," I started, but he held up a hand to silence me. He reached the door and hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. No one was there. The forest outside was still and silent, the trees casting long, dark shadows in the fading daylight. Zach stepped outside, looking around. "There's no one." Before he could finish, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the entire cabin. I screamed, running to the door and yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Zach!" I shouted, pounding on the wood. "Zach, are you there?" No response. I turned around, my back pressed against the door, and realized the room had changed. The shelves, the table, the broken mirror, all of it was gone. The walls were lined with mirrors now, each one reflecting a distorted version of the room. And in every reflection, I saw myself, standing alone. But in the mirror directly across from me, something was different. In that reflection, I wasn't alone. Behind me stood the figure with the glowing red eyes, its shadow stretching toward me like a living thing. I turned around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. "Zach," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The mirror began to ripple, its surface shifting like water. And then the figure stepped through. The figure emerged from the mirror with a fluid, unnatural motion. Its body seemed to shimmer and distort, like a reflection in rippling water. The glowing red eyes locked onto mine, and I felt frozen, unable to move or even scream. It was taller than I'd imagined, its limbs elongated and unnatural, fingers tapering into sharp, blackened points. Its face, or what passed for one, was blank and featureless except for the eyes, burning like embers in a dark void. As it moved closer, the air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and I pressed myself against the door, desperate to find a way out. "Zach!" I screamed, hoping against hope that he could hear me. The creature tilted its head slightly at the sound of my voice, a motion that was both curious and predatory. "Why are you here?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one elongated hand and pointed to the broken shards of the mirror scattered across the floor. At that moment, the room began to warp. The mirrors on the walls shimmered, and their reflections shifted. No longer did they show the distorted room. I saw the forest outside, but it wasn't the same serene place we'd walked through earlier. The trees were gnarled and blackened, their branches twisting like claws. The sky above was a dark, angry red, and shadows moved between the trees, flickering and darting like living things. The figure stepped closer, and I felt a sudden, searing pain in my chest. It wasn't physical, it was deeper, more visceral, like it was reaching into my very soul. The word wasn't spoken aloud, but I heard it echoing in my mind, a voice that was both ancient and hollow. You opened the way. What do you mean? I gasped, clutching at my chest. It didn't answer, but the images in the mirror shifted again. This time, I saw myself. I was standing in the cabin, just as I was now, but in the reflection, I wasn't alone. Behind me stood dozens of figures, identical to the one before me. Their red eyes glowed in unison, and they all moved as one, stepping closer to me in perfect synchronization. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't real. The figure in the room raised its other hand, and suddenly, the mirrors around me began to crack. Faint lines spiderwebbed across the glass, accompanied by a low, keening sound that made my ears ache. I turned back to the door, desperate to escape, and yanked on the handle with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. Zach! I screamed again, pounding on the wood. Help me! Behind me, the creature moved closer still, its presence a crushing weight against my back. And then, the door gave way. I fell through, landing hard on the ground outside. Dazed, I scrambled to my feet and looked around, but the forest was unrecognizable. The trees loomed higher than they should have, their trunks twisted and warped. The path we had taken to reach the cabin was gone, replaced by a dense thicket of thorny vines. Zach! I shouted, spinning in circles as I searched for him. The cabin door slammed shut behind me, and when I turned to look, the structure had changed. The windows were gone, replaced by more of the warped, reflective glass. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the cabin itself was alive. I backed away, my heart racing. The air was thick with a strange hum, a vibration that I could feel in my bones. And then I heard him. Emily. It was Zach's voice, faint and distant. I turned toward the sound and saw him standing just beyond the tree line, his back to me. Zach! I ran toward him, relief flooding through me. We have to get out of here. But as I got closer, I slowed. Something was wrong. He didn't move, didn't turn to look at me. His posture was stiff, unnatural, and his head was tilted at an odd angle. Zach! I said cautiously, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed his shirt, he collapsed. No, not collapsed, he crumbled. His body disintegrated into ash before my eyes, carried away on an invisible breeze. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. From behind me, I heard the low, echoing laughter. I turned slowly, and there it was, the figure, standing just a few feet away. This time, it spoke aloud, its voice a guttural rasp that reverberated in the pit of my stomach. You can run, it said, but you will never leave. The mirrors in the cabin began to glow, their reflections spilling out into the forest like liquid light. The shadows between the trees grew darker, larger, taking form. I turned and ran, my lungs burning with the effort, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Behind me, the creature's laughter followed, a constant reminder that no matter how far I ran, the nightmare would never end. I ran blindly through the distorted forest, branches clawing at my face and arms. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, almost alive, pulsing with every step I took. The laughter grew fainter as I pushed forward, but the air carried whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. You can't escape, the whispers hissed. This is where you belong. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I refused to stop. I didn't know where I was running to, there was no clear path, no landmarks, but I knew I had to keep moving. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching higher and higher, their gnarled branches blocking out the sky. Yet, after what felt like hours, I burst into a clearing. In the center stood a circular pool of water, perfectly still and eerily reflective. Surrounding it were stone pillars etched with the same spiraling symbols I had seen on the cabin walls. A strange energy radiated from the pool, tugging at me like an invisible force. For a moment, the whispers stopped. The air became heavy with silence, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Then the surface of the pool rippled. "Emily." The voice wasn't distorted or otherworldly, it was Zach's voice, clear and unmistakable. I froze, staring at the water as the ripples expanded. Slowly, an image formed on its surface. It was Zach. He was standing in a place that looked like the forest, but the trees behind him were whole and healthy, their branches lush with green leaves. The sky above him was bright, filled with sunlight. "Emily," he said again, looking straight at me. "You have to come here. It's the only way out." My heart leapt at the sight of him, but something felt wrong. His movements were too stiff, his smile too wide. "How?" I called out, my voice shaking. "The water," he said, gesturing to the pool. "Step into it. Trust me." I hesitated, glancing around the clearing. The forest was silent now, too silent, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in at the edges. "Emily," Zach said, his voice more urgent. "You have to hurry. They're coming." Before I could respond, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the trees. I turned and saw them. Figures, dozens of them, moving between the trees. Their red eyes glowed like embers, and their elongated limbs swayed unnaturally with each step. Panic surged through me. "Emily." Zach's voice cut through the fear. "Now." I didn't have time to think. The figures were closing in, their movements quickening, their guttural laughter filling the air. I stepped toward the pool. The water was ice cold as I dipped my foot in, but the moment my skin touched the surface, the world around me seemed to shift. The laughter faded, and the figures slowed, as if they were trapped in molasses. I stepped fully into the pool, and it felt like stepping into another world. The water didn't rise above my ankles, yet I felt like I was sinking. The clearing around me dissolved into blinding light, and for a moment, I felt weightless. Then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground. The sunlight was warm on my face, and the forest around me looked normal. The twisted trees, the oppressive shadows, they were gone. The air was filled with the sounds of birds chirping, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Zach." I called out, my voice hoarse. There was no response. I looked around, but there was no sign of the pool, the stone pillars, or the figures that had pursued me. It was as if the nightmare had never happened. But as I stood and dusted myself off, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and my blood ran cold. There, just beyond the tree lean, stood Zach. But his movements were off, stiff, jerky. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes glowed red. Before I could react, he vanished into the trees. I stood frozen, the weight of what I'd seen sinking in. I had escaped the nightmare, but something had followed me back.